All right, we are back with a new video, and today we will be doing a review of Celebrity Big Brother 3. And I don't plan for this video to be too long. It's just more me giving my general thoughts on the season now that it's over. And honestly, I didn't care too much for this season. I know a lot of people feel that way as well, but I think it really suffers from a weak cast, questionable production decisions, and mostly stagnant gameplay. And again, I was just walking away not really caring too much about what was happening or too much about these people. And on top of the season being largely boring, I mean, there was some pretty bad stuff happening on the feeds as well that wasn't really highlighted on the show, but we'll get into that in a moment. And like I said, it's just going over my personal thoughts on the season. Nothing too much, but let's just jump right in. First up, let's talk about the cast. Now, for celebrity season, I never heard of most of these people before the cast was announced. Now, admittedly, I'm a bit out of touch with pop culture. I mean, outside the big names, I don't bother to learn much about figures unless they're involved with stuff I care about, like Survivor or some of the shows I cover on my other channel, which is more limited and niche than usual. But I was talking to my mom about this cast, someone that was far more tuned in pop culture than I am, and even she didn't know some of these people. And the ones she did know were either B-listers or just washed up. Now, with that said, I did recognize two of them. I mean, Chris Kirkpatrick, I knew as a former member of NSYNC, and my friend pointed out that he voiced Chip Skylark on Fairly Odd Parents. So that's something. Todrick Hall was someone I knew because he let a bunch of BB23 players live in his house for a while after the season ended. And now that I'm thinking about it, Lamar Odom was the answer to one of the questions on the trivia episode of The Office. I know I watched season 8. But aside from those three, I've never heard of any of these people. But in terms of what they brought to the season, it wasn't much. I mean, if we want to go through it in boot order, we have Teddy, who is okay, I guess. Mariah was someone I really wanted to see do well, especially with her being a big fan, but she struggled to really get a foothold in the house. She got involved in some drama with Chris Kirkpatrick and then got very unlucky that Chris Kirkpatrick won HOH so early into the season. Chris Kattan had a few fun moments and some interesting DRs, but I wouldn't call him a big character or anything. You could certainly tell he was struggling a lot when on the house, and he wasn't really there to play. I mean, Chris Kirkpatrick was one of the more interesting figures on the season, but even he wasn't immune from controversy with the Mariah situation. And while he was one of the more active players in the house, he also got hung up in morality to the point where by the time he left the game, he cared more about Todrick and Misha losing than wanting to win the game himself. You have Shayna, who had a lot of support from the online community, especially after Todrick started laying on the personal attacks, which, again, not really fun to watch, and had a lot of people campaigning for her to be America's favorite player. But aside from that, she was one of the active players in the game early on. You have Carson, who was fine as a character. I understand why he won America's favorite player, especially since the edited show didn't highlight the Todrick Shayna stuff. As a player, I think he was more active early on, but you could clearly tell that once things started to not go his way, that he just stopped taking the game seriously and just wanted to hang out with his friends. Lamar was a pretty laid back presence. Like a lot of the cast, he wasn't taking the games too seriously, but I still liked him. Todd Bridges, which is kind of there for a lot of it. I found it humorous how he ended up being one of the bigger jury threats towards the end game. Cynthia, my preseason winner pick, didn't really jump off the page either. I felt like she was playing a bit harder than Carson or Todd, but even then, I didn't think she was perfect. Todrick was definitely the biggest player of the season, and it was somewhat interesting seeing him dominate the game. But I think what stopped me from enjoying it as much as I could have is just his treatment of people like Shayna and Kirkpatrick. Those interactions really painted him in a bad light morally, on top of it being bad jury management. And along those lines, I figured from pretty early on that he would struggle winning a jury vote. So while I think he played the best game of the season, which I guess is a spoiler for my player ranking, but we'll get to that later, he was pretty unlikable to watch, and I understand why he lost. And then there's the winner, Misha. Honestly, I didn't care for Misha much as a character. To me, she came off as pretty annoying at points, and watching her and Todrick come out on top was kind of a slog. Gameplay wise, I don't think she was that great socially. Strategically, while you can kind of credit her for building the power structure that more or less dominated the game, a lot of that came from her winning the first HOH. And even then, I would give more credit to Todrick for maintaining that power structure, as he had the ability to flip to Carson in his day one alliance due to their out of the game relationship. And that definitely could have screwed over Misha if he decided to stick with Carson. I also think she made some pretty terrible strategic decisions, such as turning down Lamar's final two deal and volunteering herself and Todrick to go on the block at the final seven. The reason those decisions didn't come back to bite her is either due to luck, stuff that Todrick did, or favorable comp results. And similar to Todrick, I think Misha also had pretty questionable jury management to where she only wins a jury vote against Todrick. And while I have to credit her for getting that final two scenario, I definitely feel like she could have managed certain relationships better. I mean, I plan to discuss this further in my player ranking, but I thought it was relevant to mention here. On the whole, I was pretty underwhelmed by this cast, both from an entertainment and gameplay perspective. While there were some likable people like Lamar, Mariah, and Carson, they're far from being the most memorable Big Brother has to offer. I think the more memorable people like Todrick and Chris Kirkpatrick, are interesting, but are not free from baggage. And gameplay wise, it feels like a decent chunk of this cast just wasn't playing that hard. If you ask me who cared the most about the game, I would say it was probably Todrick, Chris Kirkpatrick, Shayna, Marai, and Misha. But that also leaves people like Todd, Lamar, Chris Kattan, Carson, even Cynthia, who either didn't care or didn't have it in them to try and turn things around. This in turn led to some pretty stagnant gameplay, which I'll discuss more in a bit. So, on the whole, I would definitely call this cast a disappointment. Next, let's discuss the production and presentation. Now, in my Survivor 41 review, I had two separate sections for production, one of which focusing on in game production like twists and format, and the other focusing on out of game production like editing and TV presentation. But obviously, for this season, I figured it's best to just talk about it all at once, as there isn't much to discuss with the former. The only notable twist to discuss is the Monwan hat, which I did like. It's not too overpowered, plus, it relies on social strategy more than luck or comp. And given how the season played out, I'm kind of glad they only had it the first round, as otherwise it would have handed even more power to the majority. Aside from that, I don't have much positive to say about the season's production. This season had the same issue as BB23, where the live feed tended to just cut out a lot, which wasn't ideal. Obviously, the first week of the game wasn't even shown on the live feeds, which I understand to a degree, but it's still a disservice because there was apparently a lot that wasn't captured. The most notable of this is the drama between Marai and Chris Kirkpatrick, which ended up having a pretty big impact on the game. On the whole, I feel like the live feeds were an issue once again this season. I also wasn't a fan of the episode format. Now, obviously, you had episodes starting at different times depending on the night, which was necessary given the Olympics, which this season was meant to compete against, and the fact that they had to deal with the Amazing Race on Wednesday nights. But what I really wasn't a fan of was the 2 hour episodes airing on Friday nights. For me, these episodes really dragged as there wasn't that much to show. Like, I know that it was meant to combine the experience of two episodes of a normal Big Brother season, veto episode and eviction, into one, but it just didn't work for me, especially when the actual events being shown weren't that interesting to begin with. And I think the funniest part of all this is despite stretching out normal rounds of gameplay into these 2 hour episodes, they decided to cram the final HOH, final eviction, jury questioning, and winner reveal into a 1 hour finale. Again, I know they had to do this the way because of when it was Wednesday night and they had to air Amazing Race after, but still, I mean, if you're gonna have all these 2 hour episodes, at least to make the finale 2 hours. I think something that might have helped these 2 hour episodes is to have live competitions because for most of these episodes, people that follow the live feeds would already know the veto results going in, making the vast majority of the episode feel like filler. And if you couldn't have live HOHs, then you should have at least had live vetoes of these 2 hour episodes. I feel like that would have been the better way to go. Now, obviously, the biggest downside is that live vetoes means less time to strategize after the results are known. But on a season with a stagnant gameplay, the comp results matter a lot more than any scrambling that may happen after the fact. So overall, production was relatively standard for a Big Brother season. I know there were certain challenges with scheduling, but there were still points where I feel like things were dragging, and I feel like they could have managed that a lot better. So I don't have too much positive to say about the production side of things. Finally, I wanted to touch a bit on the gameplay this season, and as I alluded to earlier, the gameplay wasn't the greatest, and I attribute a lot of that to this cast being unwilling to play the game that aggressively. For the most part, the season was a steamroll of Todrick and Misha, who, as I already mentioned, aren't my favorite characters in the world. There were a few moments of intrigue, particularly early on with Shayna and Kirkpatrick kind of playing the middle of the house, but once they get caught by Todrick and Misha, they were targeted rather quickly. You also had Carson winning HOH, which could have been interesting, except Todrick convinced him and Cynthia to target Shayna despite the fact that at that point, Shayna was more closely aligned to Carson. That was particularly frustrating as it really prevented the game from becoming more interesting. And aside from that, there were some pretty unfortunate comp results that kept things from being interesting as well. The most egregious for me was at the final seven, where Shayna was the only person not picked for the veto, despite being the only person that could have made that round even remotely interesting. And also considering how dumb it was for Misha to volunteer herself and Todrick on the block in that round to prevent Shayna from potentially competing in the veto, and thinking about how that easily could have backfired on Misha, the fact that we didn't even get that and she sort of looked to be a genius based on that isn't the best look for me either. I mean, usually on steamrolly seasons, like you'd think stuff like this would be interesting, but just wasn't. And I haven't even mentioned the end game where Todd and Cynthia simply sucked at competitions, pretty much handing all the wins over to Todrick and Misha, which again stifled most of the intrigue. And like I said, usually on steamrolly seasons like this, while frustrating because of the lack of opportunities to flip the game and cause chaos, I can at least appreciate the gameplay of the dominant players. And I feel that way to a degree with Todrick, as it was somewhat interesting seeing him navigate the game. Him convincing Cynthia and Carson to turn on Shayna was particularly impressive from a gameplay perspective, as well as avoiding the block despite being this out in front figure. But even then, that was tempered by the realization that he was never winning. Again, his jury management was absolutely abysmal. And then you have his partner Misha, who dominated the game alongside Todrick. But even then, I was frustrated by a lot of her decisions as well. She was really someone that relied on her comp ability and her relationship with Todrick to slide through the game despite plenty of bad reads and less than ideal jury management herself. So while this was a pretty dominant performance by Todrick and Misha as a pair, I can't say I enjoyed it as much as more flawless games such as Cody from BB22, or even much of the other flawed games like Paul from BB19. There wasn't the satisfaction at the end where Todrick gets berated by the jury and then loses that way. And on the other hand, I feel like it was pretty clear that the jury didn't really like Misha either, but due to the lack of time and due to the fact that she was sitting next to Todrick, she got the win nearly unanimously. So on the whole, the season just felt like a slog, and again, it was there just wasn't that much going on gameplay wise, and at the same time, it was pretty frustrating. So, like I said, the gameplay here wasn't that great. So to wrap things up, overall, this wasn't a very good season at all. I mean, granted, some of that was to be expected, given that it was a celebrity season. And while it dragged at points, there was at least comfort in knowing that it was only 3 weeks long instead of 3 months that you get from a normal season. And I'm sure plenty of people feel like Big Brother US has kind of stagnated at this point, where a lot of the seasons just feel steamrolly, and that there just aren't that many opportunities for the game to get more interesting or chaotic. However, I'm not really ready to jump off the bandwagon yet. I mean, at the end of the day, Big Brother is a fun game, and I definitely want to continue following it in the future. And I always hold out hope that the season will afterwards will be pretty interesting. So I think there's a lot of confidence that BB24 will be an improvement for me, as I'm sure it will be for a lot of other people. So there we go. That's the video. I mean, if you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps me out. I really enjoy making this content, and I know this wasn't the best season in the world, but it was fun getting to cover it. Now, like I said, I plan to do a player ranking. I'm not sure when exactly it'll come out. Hopefully, it'll come out sometime next week, so stay tuned for that. And again, I'm covering other shows as well. I mean, Amazing Race is wrapping up this week, so I'm probably going to be doing a team ranking for that. I'm going to be covering Australian Survivor as usual, so stay tuned for more of those updates. Big Brother Canada is starting this week, so I'm pretty excited for that. And of course, Survivor 42 is starting up pretty soon, so a lot of stuff to look forward to, a lot of content coming from this channel. Stay tuned for everything. But for now, that is the video. See ya.